7 What kinds of reasoning are there? We have now finished with our detailed look at the analytical structure approach. This chapter will consider, in a more general way, how to think about the types of reasoning we might use and encounter. I already noted, in Chapter 2, that basically reasoning is either about relationships across time, cause and effect, or within the sets or groups into which we divide and classify objects at any given moment. But there are some other ways of thinking about reasoning that are worth exploring in more detail, while recognizing that there is no set way to classify or assert that you are using one type of reasoning but not another. In this chapter we will, 1. Examine the difference between deductive and inductive reasoning, a commonly misunderstood difference. 2. Look at the difference between categorical and propositional logic, to discover in particular how propositions, if, then, can be useful. 3. Look at 5 types of reasoning, known as reasoning from cause, generalization, specific cases, analogy, and terms, i.e. definitional. Deductive and inductive reasoning. A common error. The difference between deduction and induction is one of the more vexed issues in contemporary logic. Exactly how, and why, we distinguish between them is subject both to erroneous views and legitimate disagreements. First, let me dispose of a common error, one that has probably been taught to you, or you have read, at some smart thinking, skills for critical understanding and writing stage. It is often claimed that deduction is a form of reasoning from general rules to specific premises and that induction is the reverse, that is, reasoning from specific cases to a general conclusion. Now, no matter what you might see or read elsewhere, this is wrong. The difference between deduction and induction has nothing to do with general or specific reasoning, but has everything to do with what the conclusion does on the basis of the premises. We will explore this genuine difference in a moment, but let me reassure you that, if the distinction seems hard to grasp, you are not alone. Philosophers have generally sought to retreat to those examples and cases of reasoning which are clearly deductive and clearly inductive. They have not engaged with the muddy mass of indistinct cases which are, by and large, the everyday reasoning we use. Deduction and deductive reasoning. Your conclusion states with certainty a relationship between 2 or more premises. It has to be certain, because it simply makes explicit a relationship that is already there, but not directly obvious, in the combination of the claims that are serving as premises. You will remember this aspect from the discussion of claims in chapters 2 to 4. Let us look at an example. I am under 1/8, people under 1/8 in Australia cannot vote. Therefore I cannot vote. There are 3 key terms in this argument. One is age, under 18, the other is voting, and the last is T. The conclusion simply re-expresses the implicit relationship of the premises which can be expressed, in a formula way, like this: A is one of B, B can't do C, therefore A can't do C. The certainty with which, in this argument, the conclusion is stated relates not to the truth or otherwise of the premises but to the logical form of the argument. If it turns out that the premises are indeed true, then the conclusion is guaranteed both by the truth of the premises and by the form of the reasoning. The key test for a deductive argument is to ask yourself, being absolutely trusting, can you deny the conclusion, if it is that you previously have no doubt, or deny the premises? For example, African swallows are migratory birds. All migratory birds fly long distances and therefore I conclude African swallows fly long distances. Now, let us assume absolutely and without doubt that the premises are true. Can you deny, refuse to accept, the conclusion now? No. Do not be confused and think but maybe African swallows are not migratory birds. If you have this doubt, then you have not accepted the first premise. Deductive thinking is something of a mind game, an important one, nevertheless, checking for deductive entailment, where the conclusion is guaranteed by the premises. First, what kinds of reasoning are there? Of all proceeds from the assumption that the premises are absolutely correct. If they are, then you simply need to check that the conclusion follows logically from them. Only then can you go back and see if there are doubts about the premises. Induction. In an inductive argument, unlike deduction, if the premises are true, then the conclusion is only probably true, and how big a chance that it is true depends on the weight of evidence presented in the premises. The conclusion, then, in an inductive argument is not guaranteed by the premises, but only supported by them. Often, The difference expresses itself in the way that an inductive conclusion does not state an implicit relationship but goes beyond the premises to make a new claim altogether. Here is an example. Imagine that, in the best traditions of the board game Cluedo, you are conducting a murder investigation. Mr. Green's body has been found stabbed to death. In the course of your investigations, you discover that Mr. White says he saw Mr. Black stab Green. Black is well known to have hated Green. Green's blood is found on Black's hands. Ms. Yellow heard Green gasp, "Black is stabbing me." These four claims serve as reasonably compelling evidence that Mr. Black was the murderer. However, can you be certain? No. You can only gather evidence to increase the probability that you are correct in judging Black to be the murderer. Indeed, if this case were to go to court, then the test used by the jury to convict or not convict would be one of reasonable doubt. The jury would not have to be 100% certain, simply convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that Black was guilty. So, although you would accuse Black as if you were certain he was the murderer, in purely logical terms you would not have deduced that conclusion from the evidence, but have induced it and thus always be fractionally short of absolute certainty. Remember that the claim which serves as the conclusion in this argument, Black killed Green, is not completely implied in the premises, as we shall see. You, being a good detective, do some more checking and discover that White told people Black hated Green. Black got bloody trying to help Green. White disguised himself as Black to do the job. Hence, the probability now swings around to White being the murderer. Again, you cannot be certain, but would probably now proceed to accuse White. Induction, then, is the process of gathering evidence and, rather than stating something already completely contained in the premises, but not openly stated, smart thinking, skills for critical understanding and writing, making some prediction or estimate of what the most likely conclusion would be given that evidence. The lesson to learn here is, if you think about the kinds of complex arguments that you have been developing in earlier chapters of this book, what you will probably see is that, towards the end of a complex argument, the reasoning will become deductive, carefully delineating a logical set of relationships that, in the earlier parts of the complex argument, have been established through inductive reasoning. Categorical and propositional logic. Now we will look at the two common forms of deductive reasoning. For a long time, logic was primarily thought to consist in the formation of definitive relationships, such as the deductive examples above, normally expressed in the form, humans are mammals. All mammals breathe air. Therefore humans breathe air. Such reasoning is called categorical precisely because it is not about actual events so much as the ideal categories by which we can define and discriminate the innumerable things in the world into a regular pattern or order. What is significant is that categorical logic is mostly associated with European thinking prior to the modern era of scientific investigation and the constant quest to discover what was new, rather than earlier attempts to precisely define an ever-changing pattern of categories and attributes. It should also be noted that this form of reasoning depends absolutely on how we define terms such as air and breathe, and how precisely we use words in our claims. Technically, fish also breathe. They breathe water and extract from it, if not air then air's constituent elements. Yet fish are not mammals. Thus, while useful to understand, categorical reasoning is more interesting for our purposes in that it models how dominant forms of reasoning are bound up in the social order of their time. Propositional logic, on the other hand, depends upon propositions, statements that propose a relationship between two states of affairs. Technically, these statements should be expressed as if, then, claims. However, it is possible to write them in such a way as to imply, rather than explicitly state, the propositional nature of the claim. If the ancient Greeks spent a lot of time philosophizing about how specific items and general groups might be put together and thus developed categorical logic to a fine art, in the 19th century, European philosophers became fascinated by propositional logic. If/then statements are, probably, at the heart of most of our reasoning, even though we often do not realize it. They link together one event, the if part, and propose that if it happens, then something. What kinds of reasoning are there? 93 else will also occur. It is, perhaps, the philosopher's version of Newton's third law of thermodynamics, which stated that all actions have an opposite and equal reaction. Let us have a look at an example which uses a series of if/then statements to prove that Australia's economic health depends, not on low wages, but on high wages. 1. If Australia's wages are reduced, then people will have less to spend. 2. If people have less to spend, then consumption will fall. 3. If consumption falls, then the economy will slow down. 4. If the economy slows, then business profits will fall. 5. Therefore, if we want to avoid a loss in profit, we must not reduce wages. The power and flexibility of propositional logic is demonstrated by this example, not because these premises guarantee the conclusion is true, but rather because they create a series of logical relationships between two otherwise apparently unconnected events, the need to avoid a loss in profit and the desire not to reduce wages. If we were then to set about convincing someone of this ultimate conclusion, we would, by having set up the chain of propositions in this manner, have identified the key sub-conclusions that would each need to be supported by sub-arguments. Thus, we would have to establish that it was indeed reasonable to believe that if consumption falls, then the economy will slow down, and we might do this by reference to real-world examples such as previous economic conditions in which a fall in consumption has indeed caused an economic slowdown. The lesson to learn here is, while categorical logic concerns itself with the structural relationship of the categories we use, defining the inclusions and exclusions so that we can be sure what does or does not belong together as a group, propositional logic prompts us to ask the right questions about what we need to establish, inductively, to then make our overall argument convincing. 5 types of reasoning. It is important to recognize that these 5 types are not mutually exclusive. We will consider causal reasoning but, for example, we also see that when looking at causes we are also asserting analogies between the cause of one event and another. Equally, when we look at analogies, there are ways in which analogical reasoning is the same as reasoning from generalizations or might involve causal relationships. Thus, the 5 types presented here are not done so in the same manner as the discussion of deduction/induction, which showed how arguments of one type, in each case, could not be of the other type. Rather, I present these 5 types to assist you in thinking more broadly about the kinds of questions you might ask in your reasoning and, as we will see in Chapter 8, to guide your search for information. Smart thinking, skills for critical understanding and writing. Causal reasoning. Reasoning from cause is very common and we are all familiar with it, if only in a common sense way. If someone asks you why did you buy this book? You might reply because it was reasonably cheap and looked interesting. Alternatively, you might say because someone recommended that I buy it, or even because it was a compulsory textbook for my studies. In all cases, you have stated what event or fact caused you to buy this book. Hence, in a causal relationship between claims, the premise or premises state the cause, and the conclusion states the effect resulting from that cause. Now, very often we use a simple causal claim, such as Australia's economic weakness in the world economy is caused by its reliance on commodity exports. As we know, a claim does have an internal connection between the cause and the effect. We should be careful to remember that a single claim, such as the one just given, is not an argument or explanation. However, this claim does imply that it is the result of, or conclusion to, causal reasoning. So, in making good links between premises and conclusions, where we are reasoning about cause and effect, we need to spell out what that relationship is. For example, Australia is reliant on commodity exports. Such exports are always at risk of natural disasters and price fluctuations. These risks lead to weakness, and hence, Australia has a weak economy in global terms. When we are attempting to link claims in order to express a causal relationship, there are 2 general rules that are particularly useful. First of all, we can look for the factor that is the only difference between 2 given situations. For example, before recent changes to industrial relations laws, labor unions could not be excluded by employers from most wage negotiations. Now they can be. Not much else has changed, however. Since this legislative change took place, average wages have declined dramatically. Hence, I conclude that the likely cause of this reduction in wages has been the exclusion of unions from wage negotiations. The 2 situations that are being compared are the higher level of average wages in the past and the lower level of average wages now. The argument in the example seeks to establish that the only differing factor in these 2 situations, which might explain the change in wage levels, is the exclusion of unions. We can express this rule thus: X is the cause of Y because the only relevant difference between Y happening and not happening is that X was only present when Y happened. The second general rule for determining causal relationships requires us to look for the only similarity or common element in two or more situations. Take the following argument as an example: what kinds of reasoning are there? Jones and Wilson have both been sacked by the company that used to employ them. Jones, a middle-aged male cleaner, was a poor worker with a history of arriving late. Wilson, a young woman working as a filing clerk, had always been judged by her boss to be a competent worker. But both Jones and Wilson had just been elected union delegates, and thus, I would reasonably conclude that it was their active participation in the union that led to their dismissal. The differences between the two workers contrast with their similar treatment. Both were sacked, so, the only other similarity between them, that they were union delegates, seems to be the likely cause of their dismissal. We can express this rule thus: X is the cause of Y because it is the only relevant similarity between two separate occurrences of Y happening. The other key aspect to causal reasoning is to appreciate that some causal events are necessary, and others are sufficient. If I assert that oxygen is necessary for a fire to occur, I am not saying that oxygen causes fires. Thus the presence of oxygen is a necessary condition, but not sufficient. However, while a lighted match is sufficient to set fire to a pile of dry paper if dropped on it, it is not necessary. I can also use a flamethrower or focus the heat of the sun with a magnifying glass. In the many complex causal situations that we encounter, it will be impossible to isolate the only relevant difference or the only relevant similarity. We will also struggle to determine necessary and sufficient causes because we cannot, normally, conduct repeated experiments in which we determine the relative state of each causal element. Rather, we will normally be confronted by a whole jumble of possible differences and similarities. So, the main function of our investigation of causes, and of the resulting causal arguments and explanations we write, will be to assign some significance to each cause. Was it a minor or major cause? Was it significant enough to count as a sufficient cause on its own? Or to discover the interrelationship between causes. We also need to consider the degree to which each cause was beyond or within human control. Was the cause a direct human action, or something in the general environment? Further, we need to avoid assuming, simply because events happen in close proximity to one another, that they are necessarily related as cause and effect. Perhaps it was simply a coincidence that, for example, the two workers were sacked. Alternatively, we might argue, in relation to the first example, that there is a common cause. Wage reductions and union exclusion are not necessarily effect and cause but, rather, could both be the effects of some other cause, perhaps structural changes in the political economy of Australia. Reasoning from generalization is another common form of argument or explanation. Yet it is very different from causation. If causation, at its simplest, smart thinking, skills for critical understanding and writing seeks to show how one event leads to another, reasoning from generalization shows how knowledge about a general class or category of events allows us to make a conclusion about a specific event that fits the general category. For example, all children who have been fully immunized are protected against some common and life-threatening diseases, such as whooping cough, polio, and diphtheria. Therefore, Stephen, who has been immunized, is most unlikely to fall sick with these diseases. The general form of such arguments is as follows: Class X is defined by the fact that the individual cases within that class all have property A in common, hence any individual case that is a member of that class will also exhibit property A. So, arguing from a generalization involves two distinct steps. First of all, it must be established that the specific case does indeed fit the general class that is proposed, that it is consistent. Once that fit is established, then we must draw a conclusion that relies, not on our knowledge of the specific case, but our knowledge of the general class. Imagine, for a moment, that you are a doctor. A woman comes to see you with the following symptoms: swollen glands, sore throat, weakness in the muscles, and a rash of small red spots across the back and chest. You are not sure what is wrong with the patient but can use reasoning to make a diagnosis. Almost all people who have these symptoms are suffering from measles. This particular patient has these symptoms, therefore she is suffering from measles. Further, You can determine treatment on the basis of the generalization that all people suffering from the measles need to spend a week resting in bed and take antibiotics to prevent secondary infections. You know, with reasonable confidence, that this patient has measles and so can prescribe this treatment for her. Let us explore this form of relationship by imagining that a class is like a box into which we put all the items that are the same as one another. On the lid of this box are a list of requirements that determine which items can and cannot be included. Patients who have the swollen glands and sore throat, but not the red spots, could not be placed in the measles sufferer class because they would not meet all the requirements. Patients with the red spots but no other symptoms would also fail to qualify, they probably have a skin irritation instead. However, as well as a set of requirements for membership of a class or category, a generalization also includes a judgment that sums up the nature of those items in the category. People with these symptoms have measles. Hence there are two aspects to a generalization, a condition that determines what specific cases fit into the generalization, and another condition that states the common consequence or state relating to that generalization. What kinds of reasoning are there? When we are confident about our generalizations, and a specific case does fit a particular general category, then reasoning from generalizations is very easy and effective. The trick is in making that initial judgment about the relationship between the specific case and the generalization, as expressed in the premises, so that our conclusion, also about the specific case, is well supported. At the same time, we should recognize that many items fit a number of generalizations, that often an item has many conflicting qualities or components that make it hard to judge the appropriate generalization. For example, doctors are often confronted with a series of symptoms in a patient that could mean any one of a number of illnesses. The tests that doctors perform are designed to work out exactly which generalization to apply to the specific patient and thus make sure that the correct treatment is prescribed. Reasoning from specific cases. Where do these generalizations come from? Do we just make them up? No, in most cases they have been established via reasoning, in this instance, from specific cases to a generalization. The difference in reasoning from specific cases is that, although a general statement is involved, it is not used as a premise but as the conclusion. We routinely find such reasoning in, for example, opinion polls, statistical analyses, or any other surveys in which the reasoning supports conclusions that generalize beyond the specific scope of those premises. For example, I might argue from specific cases in this manner: I have surveyed 1,000 Australians, from all social classes and ethnic backgrounds, and 70% of them tell me that they favor changing from a monarchy to a republic. Hence, I would conclude that most Australians also support this change. 90% of the respondents who were born overseas or whose parents were born overseas were positive about Australia becoming a republic. Hence, I further conclude that Republican sentiment will be strongest among the newer members of the Australian community. There are two conclusions here, each is a general statement about what all Australians think, based on a sample of 1,000 specific cases. The premises provide a summary of the many specific cases. Nevertheless, relative to the premises, the conclusions are much broader assertions, most Australians and newer members. The general form of such arguments is as follows: specific cases, X, of the general category X show the common property A, hence, generally speaking, we can expect all members of the category X to have the common property A. Reasoning from specific cases depends on the same sorts of judgments about the underlying relationship between the cases and the general category that we encountered in the previous section on reasoning from generalizations. If, for smart thinking, skills for critical understanding and writing example, I had unluckily chosen a sample of 1,000 Australians who are unusually pro-republic, then it is unlikely that my broad conclusions would be correct. So, good reasoning from specific cases requires some consideration of the degree to which the cases selected represent the general category as a whole. This question of representativeness is precisely why reasoning from specific cases needs to proceed on a sound base of specifics. If I were to argue, on the basis of one bad meal of Italian food, that / Italian food was bad, I would be relying on far too small a sample for my argument to be effective. Equally, we should not trust surveys that rely on large numbers of responses from an unrepresentative group. For example, television stations have taken to conducting polls in which people ring in to answer yes or no to a particular question, For example, should the death penalty be reintroduced? The answer is then represented as a good generalization of all Australians' attitudes when, in fact, it is only a generalization of the views of those viewers of that particular television station who were able and willing to ring in. Reasoning from analogy. An analogy is a special form of reasoning, which has some similarities with reasoning from specific cases. Reasoning by analogy involves drawing an equally specific conclusion from specific premises via a comparison of like aspects. Good analogies avoid comparisons between items that have too many dissimilarities. For example, imagine a friend gave you a guinea pig to look after but forgot to tell you anything about what to feed it. You might say to yourself, I have a guinea pig and do not know what to feed it, but I do know that my rabbit eats carrots, and that rabbits and guinea pigs are similar. Hence, I can probably feed my guinea pig carrots as well. Such arguments take the following general form: an analogy between X and Y, in the premises, supports a conclusion about Y by showing that the conclusion is true of X, and X and Y are similar in sufficient relevant respects and are not relevantly dissimilar. You need to be careful to make sure that you are comparing things that are similar in a relevant way. Take the following example of reasoning: shaving cream is clearly similar in color, texture, moistness, and body to whipped cream, and I know that whipped cream is delicious on fruit salad. Hence, shaving cream is delicious on fruit salad. Did you see what is wrong? The two types of cream are similar, but they are definitely not similar in respect of the one main characteristic involved in fruit salad eating: how they taste. This question of relevance has been explored in more detail in Chapter 6. What kinds of reasoning are there? While generalized and specific reasoning both depend on classifications of individual cases in relation to general categories, analogies depend on comparison and consistency between equally specific or equally general cases. First of all, good analogies that do not directly involve values are formed through comparing different things on the basis of consistency of knowledge. That is, we look around for known cases that are similar to the unknown case, so that we are better able to predict what we will find out. For example, if we knew that large oil spills at sea destroy the saltwater environment, we might also predict that similar spills in a freshwater lake would have a similarly destructive impact. Such analogies depend on the extent to which we are sure that the world is a consistent place, and that it is very unlikely we will find radical differences between cases similar in many respects. Second, good analogies that involve values are formed through comparing different things on the basis of consistency of action or belief. That is, we can use known cases that have known types of action or belief associated with them and that are similar to the unknown case to thereby conclude that similar actions or beliefs can be expected in those cases. Such analogies depend on the assumption that the world ought to be a consistent place and, to the extent that we can control what we do in the world, that we should always try to do the same things in similar situations. For example, we would think it most unreasonable if, of 3 cars parked illegally, only ours was given a parking ticket. Such rules need to be applied consistently and we expect that they will be. Reasoning from terms. The final type of reasoning is less common but equally important. Some claims, as we have seen, establish the definition of a particular word or phrase. Often we need to give reasons for our definitions, either because there is some widespread doubt about them or because we are trying to establish a particular meaning in a given context. Here is an example: in a true democracy, all power rests with the people. Constitutionally speaking, in a monarchy some power theoretically resides with the monarch. Hence, a monarchy is not democratic. Now, generally speaking, many monarchies, such as Australia, are democratic. However, this argument establishes that, in a particular context, constitutional theory, monarchies must be defined as undemocratic. While this definition may seem unusual and even irrelevant to daily life in countries such as Australia, it does have some utility within that limited context nevertheless. We tend to find that, by its nature, definitional reasoning is deductive. Exercise 7.1. Write arguments or explanations using each of the types of reasoning just discussed. You should write these examples in the analytical structure format. Smart thinking, skills for critical understanding and writing, that is, as a list of claims and a diagram. Choose issues that are important to you and about which you have some knowledge. You will probably find that each one combines some elements of more than one type,